You're listening to episode 135 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Today we have a roundtable discussion with Charles Prebish, Sarah Haynes, Justin Whitaker, and Danny Fisher on the changes in the American Buddhist landscape. Our cultural landscape is changing, and it seems the rate of change is more rapid than ever. We've seen tremendous progress in civil rights, diversity issues, and of particular interest to Buddhists, our communities of practice. There is now a much wider representation in America of traditional Buddhism and increasingly secular groups. Whatever you find most helpful to you in your practice, it's likely out there somewhere or on the way. But that wasn't always the case. Buddhism has grown through the pioneering efforts of those from particular traditional backgrounds, and their sanghas reflected that. Today we're going to have a roundtable discussion that's a response, not to the cultural landscape's change, but to criticisms about past efforts to understand that landscape at the time. Understanding that this is a controversial topic, we've invited the participation of 4 Buddhist scholars to discuss it and provide their insight and point of view. Charles Prebish is among the most prominent scholars in studying the forms that Buddhist tradition has taken place in the United States. Dr. Prebish has been an officer in the International Association of Buddhist Studies and was co-founder of the Buddhism section of the American Academy of Religion. In 1994, he founded the online Journal of Buddhist Ethics, which was the first online peer-reviewed journal in the field of Buddhist studies. Prebish has also served as editor of the Journal of Global Buddhism and Critical Review of Books in Religion. In 1996, he co-founded the Routledge Critical Studies in Buddhism series, and currently co-edits the Routledge World Religions series of textbooks. He is also co-editor of the Routledge Encyclopedia of Buddhism project. Sarah Haynes is assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Western Illinois University. Her primary area of research is Tibetan Buddhism, specifically Tibetan Buddhist ritual and its manifestations in North America. She has also conducted research on Jodo Shinshu communities in North America and their relationship to Mormon communities in Utah and Alberta. Her publications include A Relationship of Reciprocity, Globalization, Skillful Means, and Tibetan Buddhism in Canada in Wild Geese, Studies of Buddhism in Canada, An Exploration of Jack Kerouac's Buddhism, Text and Life Journal of Contemporary Buddhism, and the forthcoming collection of essays, Wading into the Stream of Wisdom, Essays in Honor of Leslie Kawamura. Justin Whitaker is a student of Damien Keown and a PhD candidate at Goldsmiths, University of London. There he is working on a thesis comparing early Buddhist ethics and the work of German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Mr. Whitaker holds a BA with honors in philosophy from the University of Montana and an MA with distinction in Buddhist studies from Bristol University. He has extensive experience teaching Buddhist studies and philosophy as an instructor and teaching assistant at the University of Montana, as well as Antioch University's Education Abroad program based in Bodh Gaya, India, and currently works as a distance education instructor in comparative world religions for Mojave Community College, Arizona. He has presented papers at several academic conferences, including Meditation's Ethics, Ignatian Spiritual Exercises and Buddhist Metta Bhavana at the American Academy of Religion's 2009 International Conference in Montreal, as well as Wriggling Eels in the Wilderness of Views, Studies in Buddhist Ethics for the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies, and Warnings from the Past, Hope for the Future, the Ethical Philosophical Unity of Buddhist Traditions at the International Association of Buddhist Universities UN Day of Vesak, both in 2012. Reverend Danny Fisher is the author of the Patheos blog Off the Cushion, maintains an official website, and writes for Shambhala Sun, Buddha Dharma, The Practitioner's Quarterly, and ElephantJournal.com. Reverend Fisher's commentary on Buddhism in the United States has been featured on CNN, the Religion News Service, Entertainment Television, and others. Reverend Fisher earned his Master's of Divinity from Naropa University and his doctorate in Buddhist Studies from University of the West. He is also professor and coordinator of the Buddhist Chaplaincy Program at University of the West. He was ordained as a lay Buddhist minister by the Buddhist Sangha Council of Southern California in 2008 and is certified as a mindfulness meditation instructor by Naropa University in association with Shambhala International. He also serves on the advisory council of the Upaya Buddhist Chaplaincy Program, and in 2009 became the first ever Buddhist member of the National Association of College and University Chaplains. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice white grape juice. And our guests today are Charles Prebish. Chuck, thanks for being here.
Hi.
And Sarah Haynes. Sarah, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And our friend Justin Whitaker. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ted.
And Reverend Danny Fisher. Danny, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ted. Good morning.
Our subject today is a roundtable discussion about a topic that has gotten quite a lot of attention over the years on some writings that, Chuck, you had done. And so I wonder if you could give us the introduction and paint the background before we launch into our roundtable discussion.
Okay. Well, as you indicated, I'm Charles Prebish, and I'm now a retired professor of religious studies, first at Penn State University and then at Utah State University, and I've been retired since the very beginning of 2011. I guess if I was going to hang a label on my statement to get this started, I'd probably say that we could call it Complaints of an Angry White Jewish Pro-Asian American Buddhist. So let me see what I can do to introduce the topic. To try and be as succinct as possible and not ruffle too many feathers, I should say that I never imagined the controversy that would result from my so-called two Buddhisms theory. Nonetheless, it's raged for 2 decades, and I think it's more than fair to say that it has truly gotten out of hand, with many people arguing about things I never said or intended. In addition, I'd be willing to bet that most of the people arguing about my theory never even read the article I wrote called Two Buddhisms Reconsidered. It was published in England in a journal called Buddhist Studies Review, and to my knowledge has never been posted on the internet, so likely has not been available to the vast majority of individuals who have been lambasting my theory, and there's really only 2 pages on it in my book Luminous Passage. So let me say just a little in the way of offering some small start to our discussion, and then it can go wherever it goes. In the first place, the phrase two Buddhisms goes back to my 1979 book titled American Buddhism. In my article, Two Buddhisms Reconsidered, I concluded the first portion of the volume with a summary section called A Tradition of Misunderstanding Two Buddhisms in America. In my use of the term two Buddhisms, I was not implying that there were only 2 kinds of Buddhism in America, however conceived, but rather that there had been 2 completely different lines of development in American Buddhism. The first form of Buddhism, I argued, represented the Buddhism practiced essentially by Asian American communities. Collectively, they emphasized basic Buddhist doctrines and practices, many of which reflected their sectarian peculiarities, were markedly conservative, and presented a primarily stable climate for their members. The second line of development included those groups that emerged shortly after the social and religious revolution of the 1960s. At that time, I described these latter groups as flashy, opaquely exotic, and hip. In many cases, they depended on the personal charisma of a flamboyant Asian master for their impetus, often eschewing basic Buddhist doctrine and solid Buddhist practice in favor of something far more uproarious. Invariably, it was these latter groups that caught the public eye, often arousing serious suspicion about the nature of obviously progressing Buddhist movement in America. That's all I said. Remember, this was the 1970s. There were no previous books on the subject, excepting Emma McCloy-Lehman's Buddhism in America. So I was one of the very first researchers on this topic, and I was simply trying to describe what I saw when I visited Buddhist centers. I had to have some language to convey to readers what I was describing. These were simple labels. They were never intended to be racist labels, never intended to be final or even complicated. That was 1979. As I went on to say in the article, Two Buddhisms Reconsidered, I never heard the phrase two Buddhisms again until December 1992, when Rick Fields used it in a telephone conversation. He was inviting me to write an article in Tricycle on the disconnect between Asian American and Euro-American Buddhism. Those are his terms, brought about by by the well-known refusal of Helen Tworkov as editor to publish Ryo Imamura's letter to the editor protesting what he believed to be her racism. Helen Tworkov, of course, rejected my article, which led to its revision and publication in Buddhist Studies Review. In the article, I went on to say, in the interim, only the descriptive language had changed, reflective perhaps of a concern for being politically correct. One Buddhism now referred exclusively to Asian American Buddhist groups in America, to some extent considered highly fundamentalist or dogmatic or devotional by its rivals. The other Buddhism included mostly members of European-derived ancestry, deemed intellectually arrogant or purely enlightenment-seeking, or even white Buddhists by its seemingly adversarial ethnic Buddhist counterparts. At best, the above is hardly reflective of Buddhist tolerance and compassion, and at worst symptomatic of an inferred racism on each side. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be going too far, I think, to submit that all of the above claims are to some extent true. Okay, let's remember that during the 1980s, Buddhism's growth in America had slowed, so when I was asked to write about two Buddhisms in the early 1990s, there were still, for the most part, only two Buddhisms to be seen, mostly Asian American communities and mostly European American communities. And these communities did not mix. Paul Numrich's notion of parallel communities highlighted that. In addition, there were very, very few black faces or Hispanic faces to be seen in the American Buddhist movement. Obviously, after the mid-1990s, all that changed. Now there's hybridity in Buddhist communities, regionalism in Buddhist communities, denominationalism in Buddhist communities, and so forth. All of which I have acknowledged and supported in my papers and publications. Anyone who's read my memoir, An American Buddhist Life, knows that, or if you've watched the YouTube video of my keynote address for the Buddhism in Canada conference at UBC in the fall of 2010, would have seen that. What I do not support is revisionist history, which tries to negate what was true 40, 30, 20, and even 15 years ago in terms of what is true only now. That's why I vehemently resist works like Shannon Hickey's Two Buddhisms, Three Buddhisms, and Racism article, which grossly misrepresents what I saw on the ground in my travels. And for the record, I guess that's why I also vehemently resist crediting people like Tom Tweed for coming up with the self-identification notion as a standard means for identifying Buddhists in America. He said that in 1998 for the first time, did not credit my work when I first made that argument in my American Buddhism book in 1979. I think that's something that I prefer not to name. Additionally, I think if Jan Nadier had actually read or carefully read my Two Buddhisms Reconsidered article, she would have seen that I cited Peter Williams' 1990 notion of three ways Asian religions impact on America. Ethnic religions, or those practiced by Asian immigrants and to some extent by their descendants. Export religions, or those popular among well-educated, generally intellectual Americans. And new religions, or those developing in consonance with the process outlined by Jacob Needleman and others, and often as revolutionary outgrowths of religion cited in the first two categories. And gee, apart from Nadier using the phrase baggage Buddhism, that sounds a lot to me like Peter Williams' categories. It seems to me like none of what I said above finds its way into the writings of the new generation of scholars in American Buddhism, like Shannon Hickey, Jeff Wilson, Scott Mitchell, and even David McMahon. Nor does it find its way into the blogs of the angry Asian Buddhists or other non-scholar writers. Instead, all they do is jump on the Two Buddhisms theory, dismiss it, and then, with the exception of Jeff Wilson, I think, offer absolutely nothing new. Jan Willis, in fact, a longtime good friend, had said in a speech that she made at Naropa Institute that Charles Prebish made statement of the fact that typologies are not cast in stone. And then she went on in a Buddha Dharma article to say that my Two Buddhisms theory was outdated and simplistic, which doesn't seem to make sense. All of these people, I think, ignore The Developmental History of Buddhist Studies and American Buddhism, and I think we can talk about that later. Finally, at the fairly recent Buddhism Without Borders conference, which was 2 years ago, in which 18 of the 24 papers dealt with the two Buddhisms theory in one fashion or another, one very well-known American Buddhism scholar privately confided to me in a local coffee house that he wished that all these newbies, and that's what he called them, newbies, would quit whining about the two Buddhisms theory and either just shut up, offer something better, or move on to some new topic. That's a very close paraphrase of what he said then. So I think at that point, maybe this is a good spot for me to stop and let the others jump in.
Thank you very much, Chuck. It paints a very good picture, and I think it highlights a few very important points you brought up. Is that first, the necessity of actually having read a paper before providing criticism. As you said, it may not even be available on the internet, and that's something I'll check for folks who are listening to the podcast. If I can find it, I will link to it. And second is that, as you stated, this is acknowledging the state of affairs at the time that things are written, and to acknowledge that, for example, in the 60s, that there was racial segregation, and disagreements about that is simply a statement of fact. It's not a statement implying a judgment about it. And that's also something that you've pointed out, and that, of course, things are changing. That since that time, we've seen a great evolution in the wide diversity of how the Dhamma is being practiced today. So thank you for painting that background. What I'd like to do now is go to each of our other panelists and get some of their initial thoughts on this, and ask each of them to just give a sentence or two about their background. And Justin, if you don't mind, we will start with you.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Ted. My background, I studied philosophy. I did a BA in philosophy at the University of Montana, where I did some Buddhist studies as well. And finishing that, I kind of had to decide whether to go into Buddhist studies or philosophy for my graduate work. And just so happened to be interested in Buddhist ethics primarily, and was sent over to England, where I am now, actually today, in Bristol, to do a master's degree with Paul Williams and Rupert Gethin, two quite well-known academics who have done good Buddhist studies work as well as from a philosophical angle. After that, I actually went back and started a master's degree in philosophy, not quite finished with my philosophy interests. But before I finished that up, I got into a PhD program back in England at the University of London, which I'm working on finishing up right now, where I'm comparing some aspects of Buddhist ethics with German philosopher Immanuel Kant. So that's kind of my background as an academic. I've practiced in several traditions and have found great value in meditation in general. So I try to keep that up as much as I can. And in terms of today's discussion, for the most part, I came to this, again, from this kind of philosophical Buddhist studies angle, and was very sympathetic with Chuck's concern that these categories can't just be thrown out. We can't just complain about a category no longer fitting the subject matter and then toss it out without suggesting something new. So I was drawn into that aspect of kind of Chuck's writing, and have seen much the same thing in my studies on Buddhist ethics. So in Buddhist ethics, people try to classify Buddhism as either deontological, utilitarian, and so on. And others just say, well, categories don't work, we need to throw them away. So I see much resonance in my own work, as with what Chuck is doing. So that's kind of where I'm coming to this discussion from, is actually looking at categories themselves. How do we use categories in both a very useful way that captures the subject that we're talking about, and is still sympathetic to the subject and to how people identify themselves. So I guess the question I would bring to this, first of all, is how much do we tolerate the inaccuracy of our categories, if and when they do grow to be inaccurate?
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Sarah, let's move on to you. If you'd tell just a couple of sentences about your background and then your thoughts on our discussion topic today.
Sure. I started as an undergraduate at Wilfrid Laurier University, where, some almost 20 years ago, I actually first met Chuck, although he probably doesn't remember it.
No, he does.
And then I moved on to the University of Calgary, where I completed a PhD under the guidance of Leslie Kawamura in Buddhist studies, which was a degree that was very much a classical training, textual-based PhD, but I never lost that interest in examining how Buddhism manifests in North America, and that's where I currently am with my research. Back to my original interests. I'm currently at Western Illinois University in a tenure-track position where I teach Asian religions, and my research these days is on Tibetan Buddhist communities and looking at ritual adaptation in the diaspora, as well as some side research on changes within Jodo Shinshu communities in North America as well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, tell us about your thoughts on the situation at hand and two Buddhisms.
Sure. This podcast, this roundtable, came out of a discussion that Chuck and I had at the AAR last year, sitting there watching panelists talk about this theory without moving forward, as he noted. And I'll be honest, I have nothing to offer at this point in time in terms of moving forward, but I want to reiterate and highlight what Chuck said in the Two Buddhisms article about the fact that what we're looking at here is not a static entity, and it's something that needs to adapt. These typologies need to adapt as Buddhism adapts. And what I really want to do is ask Chuck, or have Ted ask Chuck, is where he sees this going. Does he see this typology as something that can be expanded upon? Does he see the examination of Buddhism in North America as something that we need to consider on an individual basis, looking at a community? We can only create a typology to fit that particular community. I really want to, and I'm interested in hearing what Chuck sees as the future of this discussion.
Excellent. I think what we'll do is I will ask that question after you've also chatted with Danny about it. Thank you, Sarah, very much for that input. And Danny, if you would please tell us a little bit about your background and then talk about the topic at hand of two Buddhisms.
Well, I've done Buddhist studies basically my whole academic career. I studied religion at a theology-oriented program at Denison University, and I studied under John Court, who's a South Asian religion scholar, and David Whitaker, who is a theologian. So my interest has always sort of been in Buddhist practical theology and ministry. And then when I went to graduate school at Naropa University and wrote a master's thesis about sort of Buddhist theology, chaplaincy, and North America. And I ended up using a lot of Chuck's work in that thesis, and I think started to get an inkling of a lot of what Chuck was talking about in terms of not feeling that he'd been well represented or properly understood. And so I found myself a little baffled by some of the material that I encountered later that was highly critical of Chuck, and sort of feeling that a lot of it was based on projection of what Chuck was doing rather than what I thought myself that Chuck was actually doing. I recently finished a doctorate at University of the West, where I'm now in a tenure-track position teaching and directing our chaplaincy program here. So obviously I just sort of alluded to a little bit of where I am in this discussion and why I'm interested in it. And like Sarah, whom I met at AAR this year, I was surprised to see this continuing in panels and discussions there. And I think my interest is in helping to clarify a lot of this. I think we're probably bound to have more productive discussions in the field of Buddhist studies if we're actually hearing what the other person is saying. So my hope is that we can, clarify, I think, a lot of these issues that Chuck raised, and clarify just Chuck's work for the future. I think it would be beneficial to everyone.
Excellent. Danny, thank you very much for that insight as well. So, Chuck, we're going to bring it back to you and start off with Sarah's good question. I think you and I chatted about this a little bit in our last interview, is where do you see this going? How do you see the development progressing here in the United States, at least?
Okay. I guess I should say this, that the people that I will mention are, to some degree, have actually addressed this issue, but for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, in ways that I don't think is constructive. I know that Jan Willis, who I think is a great scholar and a longtime friend, has said in her Buddha Dharma article of 2011 that she called my typology an inappropriate tool and that it was too simplistic to account for who actually is an American Buddhist. From there, she doesn't go any farther than that, so she doesn't really help us other than to make a strong case for pointing out that there are now a significant number of blacks in American Buddhism. There weren't when I first started, and the only place I did see a black face was in Soka Gakkai International. So Jan's work doesn't help me go forward. The first time I heard Shannon Hickey talk about two Buddhisms, three Buddhisms, and racism was in a paper she presented by that title in the 2004 AAR meeting, where I sat in the audience next to Paul Numrick and listened to her tear apart our arguments. She eventually published the final morph of that article in the 2010 issue of the Journal of Global Buddhism, which I founded. And after beating up on my theory for 6 years, her solution was to simply come up with these categories: offshoot groups, transplant groups, and new movements. And that doesn't strike me as anything that's particularly new or insightful, so that doesn't help. The person that I think has made the two people that I think have made the most progress in dealing with this are Jeff Wilson and someone who most people don't know, who was a graduate student named Christine Walters. Jeff Wilson has added to the discussion of American Buddhism by saying that what we've ignored was regionalism in American Buddhism. And this is something that, frankly, when I did my work, I really didn't consider at all. I was too busy simply trying to track who was who. Jeff has now argued that it's really helpful to understand that perhaps rural Buddhists in the American South would not be very familiar with the Buddhism of the same sectarian denomination as practiced by urban Buddhists in San Francisco or New York City, because there's too much disconnect between rural and urban, and that we really need to explore that. And I think that's something that very much needs to be considered. If someone had said to me in 1995, Chuck, in 10 or 15 years, your two Buddhisms theory is going to be obsolete, I would have probably said to them, I hope so. because that would mean that we'd move forward in the study of Buddhism and in the development of American Buddhism. After Jeff presented his paper at the Buddhism Without Borders conference on this, I said, Jeff, I'm really worried that in 10 years, with the onset of social media things like Facebook and MySpace and so forth, and with the growth of the internet even more, that your regionalism theory is going to become obsolete, because people in North Carolina are going to understand what it's like to live in New York City because they connect with those people, and people in New York City are going to know what it's like to live in Iowa because they connect with those people. And he looked me straight in the eye and said, it won't happen, and walked away.
and I'm here to tell him he's wrong on that, but yeah, that's another discussion.
I think that reflects a kind of arrogance that I don't want to see in this. The person that I think made the most sense to me out of anything I've seen was a young graduate student named Christine Walters, who equally criticized the two Buddhisms theory, but went forward by saying her approach to how we could do all of this was to understand American Buddhism and other forms of Buddhism in terms of what she called denominationalism. That if we considered Buddhism in terms of the traditional sectarian affiliations that have developed across the globe, even in the context of globalization, we could simply integrate American Buddhism into that context, so that we could talk about American Buddhists who were Theravadins or who were Zen or whatever within the context of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, and that we could certainly include the kinds of Buddhisms that were delineated into Buddhisms, but they would only be one small part of a larger look at the whole situation. And I think the other thing that needs to be added into this whole argument is that American Buddhist studies has grown enormously in the period between 1995 and now, or between the early 90s and now. There was no Buddhism unit in the American Academy of Religion until 1981, and from 1981 to 1986 it was only a group, which gave it two panels per year. Then it became a section. Now, in the post-1995 period, there are perhaps a half dozen spin-offs of this unit, so that there's much, much more focus on Buddhism in the American Academy of Religion. I did a survey, I've done 3 surveys of Buddhist studies scholars in the United States since the early 90s. And the first one I did in 1993 sent out 125 invitations to Buddhist studies scholars, and I got back 86 responses. In 2006, when I did the last one, I had 189 invitations, but got back 152 responses. So the vast number of Buddhist studies scholars in the United States has grown immensely in the last 10 or 12 years, and a significant number of them are scholar practitioners. They're people who are both academics in Buddhist studies, but practitioners of Buddhism, and they've plugged into participating in American Buddhist communities. So there's a lot more knowledge about American Buddhism that helps us in our quest to be able to understand new delineations like denominationalism, which we couldn't do before. Tricycle didn't start its publication until 1991. Now, if you look for Buddhist magazines out there on the web or in hard copy, you have Shambhala Sun and Buddha Dharma and Turning Wheel and lots more. And when you add in the internet to all that, the knowledge of information on Buddhist communities has grown immensely. When Don Moriel published his first book in 1988, cataloging Buddhist communities in the United States, I think there were only about 1,000 groups, and they were all meditation centers. Now, a recent study of Buddhist communities in North America shows that there's over 2,500 Buddhist communities. That was, and that paper was delivered at the panel that Sarah referred to earlier. We were just astounded at how much information was out there. And in addition, finally, there's been the development of something that I've kind of not so affectionately called the Pro Tour of American Buddhism. If you look through the back of any of the magazines I just mentioned, you find that there's Buddhist conferences and panel presentations all over the place at any time with the big name scholars of popular literature on Buddhism, like Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein and the various Zen scholars. So wherever you look, there's something being done on American Buddhism. Earlier, the only conferences that I could go back and find on American Buddhism was one in Syracuse in 1977, one at Michigan in 1987, one at IBS in Berkeley in 1992, and a Harvard conference in 1997. Those are 5 or 10 years apart. Now there's barely 5 or 10 weeks apart before without these communities sponsoring conferences. So I think that we need to look at these new categories, and I think we need to do this in a respectful way. One of the blogs we're all familiar with is the one called Angry Asian Buddhist, and it seems that he only posts issues that refer to how much he seems to hate white Buddhists. And he never really gets out there and does something to counteract that. I think I remember Justin at one point saying to me in a private email, I hope I can say this okay, that maybe the question isn't why is American Buddhism so white, but why are Asian American Buddhists so invisible? And maybe if they would, and the person who runs this blog would be much more active in doing something proactive on the part of Asian American Buddhists, maybe some of this disconnect would disappear. He, by the way, made a point of calling my Two Buddhisms model crude because I used the word ethnic. And I don't understand what's crude about the word ethnic. I never will. He said you should call us Asian Buddhists. Well, okay. that's fine. And we could do that in the context of Christine Walter's denominationalism theory. So I think we need to do more research, more informed research. I think we need to look at categories that are respectful of all the people that are out there as American Buddhists. And I think I should probably stop there for a little bit.
Yeah, wonderful points. And you brought up a few things I'd like to just briefly discuss. Is that the Jan Willis criticism of your work not being comprehensive enough is like a modern evolutionary biologist saying that Gregor Mendel's work on inheritance isn't comprehensive enough. Well, yes, that's very true, and it's still accurate, but it was 100 years ago. And of course, we've learned more since then. And so one needs to take it within the context of what were we talking about at the time. You also brought up the conferences. I've been to 3 Buddhist-themed conferences just this year alone, and there are at least 3 others that I haven't attended. And so there are many, many. So we are seeing this proliferation of information, and on the very positive side, engagement face-to-face with conferences and these kinds of events. And you also touched on something we have talked about before, this idea of scholars who are also practitioners, that separating out and needing that antiseptic sort of examination of it from a distance isn't always something we're going to see. We are passionate about this, and we are people who have had this practice change our lives in a positive fashion. So it's, I don't think, a bad thing that you can be a scholar and also a practitioner. And I also would, as you are, push back a bit on Jeff's work with this idea that things like social networking aren't going to have an impact. They already are demonstrably having an impact, as we have online practice groups. And whether their effect is, in some areas, helps blend that mix of urban city centers and with others, and that there's a cultural flattening there, or that only occurs in some cases, depending on who's going online. Of course, that's going to develop, and that's okay. And it's good to see that kind of growth in our communities. I want to shift the conversation over to our other panelists. And Justin, I was wondering what your thoughts were. As Chuck was speaking, I was taking some notes about maybe the values of labels and these references, and what some of your other thoughts may be around those things.
Well, one of the things is, as a teacher or a scholar, we need to use labels to describe whatever we're going to be describing or teaching. So we inevitably have to use these, and we have to try to use them as accurately as possible. And at the same time, if we're talking about something broad like Buddhism or American Buddhism, we're going to be necessarily very broad and thus, I guess, cut with a dull edge. So we start with certain labels, and then we can use further labels to be more and more specific. So I think the use of the 2 Buddhisms label is actually still possible today. And indeed, I learned this when I was doing my undergraduate in Buddhism and taught it later on, that in the early days of American Buddhism, there were basically 2 Buddhisms, as Chuck described. And then we can talk about the problematization of this theory and talk about hybridity and how things have changed over the years. So I do, again, sympathize with Chuck, and I don't think we should throw these labels out, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as we begin to discuss the problems that might arise when we use these labels. If we talk about Tibetan Buddhism, we have to say, this is a very broad category at the same time. Are we talking about Tibet today, or pre-1959, or, what time period? And we just begin to see that our labels ultimately just don't perfectly map reality. And that's something a commenter on my blog, American Buddhist Perspective, mentioned recently, that the map is not the terrain, and the terrain is not the map. So what we're doing as scholars is trying to create the best maps we can. Sometimes they're very kind of zoomed out, so we use very broad categories. Sometimes we really try to zoom in. And in terms of things like regionalism or denominationalism, these are just different lenses through which we can look at Buddhism. And I agree with Chuck. I think both are excellent, and they're going to help us to see Buddhism in America from different angles and in different ways. And they might bring to light some different things, like, rural community in Alabama might be very different than that New York City community, even though they're both, reading books by Thich Nhat Hanh. But in my own experience, I was in a relatively rural city in Montana, where my connection to people there was probably very minimal, just because of my kind of academic commitments. So I would, I guess, be better categorized with people in the cities or at academic institutions. So, I mean, that's just one case where regionalism is very much going to, again, be maybe a bit of a dull edge. It cuts things up and it might shed light on things, but it's not going to be perfect. And I don't think any of our broad conceptualizations of Buddhism today are going to be perfect. And I think we need to be okay with that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Justin, that it is a wonderful diversity. And the words you used on looking at it with different lenses is exactly right. Depending on how we parse the data, we're going to see different patterns, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just information. It's then what do we do with it, and how do we positively contribute to it? That's where our best efforts lie, not in, what have we done wrong? How can we move things right?
Exactly. And I think those categorizations that are most illuminative are going to be the ones that we talk about the most and that end up being taught in courses. And as they lose their illuminative power, they're just going to, fall away. So,
can I jump in and just say, I think there have been some steps in this direction on how we do that by Jeff Wilson himself. If you look at how his regionalism theory applies in his new book, Dixie Dharma, he spends a considerable amount of time talking about just how that can work in a constructive and positive way in Richmond, Virginia, where he did a case study. And the things he says are extremely helpful, even brilliant, and it makes a good start towards doing what Justin has just described.
And that just tells me I need to get hold of Jeff and have him on the podcast. So thanks for that reference. Sarah, let's move on to you. So one of the things that you're working on right now is your work with Tibetan ritual. And I'm wondering if you are seeing in the study that you are doing right now this kind of difference based on either region or community, or what are you seeing with the adaptation of ritual in Tibetan communities?
Sure. What I'm currently looking at is really focused on how the politics are affecting ritual adaptation, and looking at how this is coming out in Tibetan communities on both sides. So looking at the so-called ethnic Buddhists and the non-ethnic Buddhists, and how things like globalization, the political situation, how these are coming out and affecting Tibetan Buddhist manifestation in North America. And my work is primarily based on Canadian communities. And I think what's interesting about the Tibetan communities is that, they're distinct from the other communities because of this political angle. And in other communities where we've seen this separation or these parallel communities, I think because of the politics, in the Tibetan communities, you're seeing them coming together much more so than in the others. And what I'm interested in, and what I was thinking about listening to Chuck and the others speak, is this lack of forward movement, or this little forward movement that we've made with these categories and these typologies. Is it indicative of, the larger study of religion and the inability to categorize things, the inability to accurately and successfully define belief and practice. I was thinking about this week as I returned to the classroom and tried to, introduce students to the study of religion, and, talking to students about how these issues aren't just issues within the academic community, but there are issues for practitioners as well. And so I think that, we see the usefulness of categories and typologies, but we also need to be wary of them, and I certainly am in my own work on Tibetan Buddhist communities.
Excellent, Sarah. And that was a very good way to utilize, as Justin said, a different lens. Is ritual itself has different meaning depending on one's own approach. So I often hear that secular Buddhists don't do ritual. That is not true. I'm a secular Buddhist. I light incense, I bow, and I may have a different understanding of what it is I'm doing. And this is not a judgment call on someone with a more traditional background and the reasons that they light incense or bow. It's that whatever our understanding or belief about these are, it can still be contributive to what we're doing. And there's no need to have that be a disparagement on others' practice. We're all Buddhists here. we have the same ideas in our heads and interest in development. So, Danny, what I'd like to do then is take that as a very good segue to your work on Buddhist chaplaincy, because this question of belief and how that impacts one's practice, I would imagine is something that you run into on a fairly regular basis. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, it's very interesting at University of the West. For as small as we are, we have a fairly extraordinary diversity of students. So we have about 30 students in the chaplaincy program right now, and very few of them are from the same Buddhist community. It's kind of an even split right now between monastics and lay people. Many of our lay students are former monastics. So it's a really, I think, the students themselves are a wonderful resource for one another in terms of being able to learn about each other in their communities. And often I find I have really interesting opportunity to think about these typologies when I watch what builds friendships, what creates barriers among these students. And my sense is that Jeff Wilson's onto something with regionalism, but the denominationalism piece speaks louder. That we have students from different parts of the country, and often are very forge very quick friendships, very quick connections, often based on a shared community background or a teacher or something like that. So I remember in our first year we had someone who came from a Mormon background, came from the state of Florida. But he connected very easily with, and he sort of connected with the Fo Guangshan community, and so connected very quickly with even some of our Taiwanese venerables at the university because they shared the same practice. So, for having nothing in common regionally, there were very quick friendships and connections that came up that way. So that was striking to me at that time. Yeah, and in terms of, I appreciated what you just said about secular Buddhist and ritual. I mean, we sort of run the gambit of styles of practice and all of that. So, you can definitely observe, various pieces with our students. But actually, could you say a little bit more about belief, just to sort of direct me in response here?
Sure. That we come to have different manifestations of what's going on in our heads, and whether it's a belief in a religious sense, in the Judeo-Christian Corinthians things unseen sense, so an assertion about what happens after we die. We don't for example, have any direct understanding of this. We can't demonstrate it, so it's an open question. And different religious traditions have different beliefs about what occurs. And from, say, a more secular standpoint, our understanding, or if we want to use the word belief, is that, well, we can't really know, but we can focus on what we can demonstrate and can experience as human beings across the board, regardless of what our background is. And so our approach is, well, let's focus on what we do know, and that applies to everyone, because it's always been my assertion that if Buddhism, the practice, is valid, it would be valid for everyone, not just people who say, yes, I'm a Buddhist and I believe in X, Y, Z. So we're going to have different understandings about why we're doing the practices we're doing, and that's okay. That's not a problem. It's not about overthrowing the hallowed halls of tradition. It's about opening up the doors for people who don't necessarily resonate with that kind of practice. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I was thinking, there's a wonderful piece by a Buddhist chaplain and friend of mine named Michael Royo-Monnet. He wrote it for the Journal of Pastoral Care and Counseling, and it's a sort of his theology of doing chaplaincy from a Zen peacemaker perspective. And one of the things he sort of says is, in chaplaincy we have this challenge where our job is to work with the religious, spiritual, cultural, psychological values of the various patients that we encounter, and not to impose our own, and that can be kind of a challenge. And yet, we're called to somehow incorporate what we do, what we believe into our work. And for Michael, and I think this is literally in all the different things I've read on chaplaincy, whether it's from a Buddhist perspective or not, probably the most helpful thing I've ever read, where he says, it comes into how we creatively approach the act of listening and communicating.
Yes,
with someone.
Exactly.
So he talks about how his practice influences how he does deep listening with his patients and how he manifests compassionate presence. So he may never say a word about mindfulness, Mahakaruna, anything like that, but it's embodied in how he listens to, say, an evangelical Christian talk about their cancer diagnosis. And I found that a very, very powerful kind of, his piece is a great tool with my students when they struggle with this question of how do they do this part of the job that's often very difficult, especially when you work with someone whose beliefs are the complete opposite of yours, and still feel like you're acting with integrity from your place as a uniquely religious person. And I've never seen anyone grapple with it as eloquently as I think Michael has. And I may say that because I'm a Buddhist and it just resonates, but I think it's really smart. And whenever I've discussed that piece with others, Buddhist or not, they tend to think, yeah, he says it really well. So,
and in fact, I'm glad you brought that up. That is something that in interfaith dialogues that I participate in, we had that question about, I think one of the subjects was, why do bad things happen to good people? And we got to a point of the situation of someone who's a parent and their child has just died, and what we can bring them that's as comforting as we're able to. And every single panelist, Buddhist and Christian and Jew and Muslim and Hindu, all said, reading some scripture from our traditions is not it. It is active, compassionate, sincere, human, deep listening, exactly as you're saying. So we do see that across the board, at least in more progressive-minded practitioners of various traditions.
It's this very quick story. Often there's a lot of conversation that happens in professional chaplaincy about the appropriateness of wearing vestments. So if you're a Catholic priest, do you wear a collar? If you're a Zen Buddhist, do you wear a rakusu? That sort of thing. And I think usually people err on the side of not doing that. So you sort of, if you're a man, you might wear shirt and tie, and if you're a woman, you might, dress sort of in something a little bit, comparable. but I studied when I did my clinical chaplaincy training with a wonderful woman named Hardarshan, who was a Sikh. So she wore, all white, turban, etc. And I remember when I first met her, I thought, what an extraordinary challenge this must be, to make it about the patient when she walks into the room. And immediately, I think a lot of people, I thought, would sort of say, wow, tell me about you, and why you wear all that. And but what was so amazing to me about watching Hardarshan work was her ability to just completely send the message to the patient that she wanted to listen to them and offer them her compassionate presence. It cut through any of that. And that was a truly amazing thing, I think, for me to watch as a student, that she had such an uphill battle in terms of the logic on why we would dress certain ways and not others, and yet she's so much a compassionate listening presence that it wasn't even a thought for people, that they would just immediately bare their souls to her and sort of not get lost in, hey, why are you wearing that? That kind of thing. So it's pretty extraordinary to watch.
Wonderful, Danny. Thank you for sharing that. What I'd like to do now is just get some concluding remarks from everybody. And one, I'd like to start, Chuck, with you. But one of the things I wanted to ask you as part of the question is that we were talking earlier about the invisibility of Asian Buddhists, and I'm wondering if that is an invisibility, perhaps to white Buddhist communities, if we're still seeing that kind of separation. And so thoughts on that, and any concluding thoughts you have, Chuck?
Well, I'll start with what you said last. I think that it would certainly be possible for people within the Asian American Buddhist community to do the same sorts of things that Tricycle and Buddha Dharma and Shambhala Sun have already done. And I would like to see that happen. It just doesn't seem that anybody's picking up the mantle and doing that. And I don't know how to promote that other than to be supportive of Asian American Buddhist communities and hope that it will happen, that they will use the same energy and vitality that some of the other groups have had in doing this. It's not impossible to start another magazine like Tricycle or Buddha Dharma, which are great publications, and have it focus on Asian Americans. Quite the opposite of what Tricycle had done in its early years. In looking toward the future, I guess I would say this. When I did my book Luminous Passage in 1998, I tried to frame some categories of typology for studying American Buddhism, and the categories I used were ethnicity, practice, democratization, engagement, and adaptation. And I think that in looking ahead, those categories for investigation are still valuable. I framed that study in two bookends, one of which was who is a Buddhist, and that's now been resolved by simply saying self-identification is the best way. And I concluded by saying the other bookend was ecumenicism, which I think is maybe an outmoded title now. Maybe it's morphed into something that would be more appropriate as global Buddhist dialogue. But I think in the context of having so much ease of communication across barriers, I think I would love to see that, and I have suggested to some other people, although without a great deal of success, that I'd love to see two book series develop. One which would be called The Generations of Buddhist Studies, which would involve the work of brilliant, great, long-standing scholars like Bob Thurman and Luis Gomez and Donald Swear and others, generation by generation, sharing their thoughts on why they entered the discipline of Buddhist studies, how they've seen it develop, what they think is important for the future, and do that before they die. Because some very well-known Buddhist study scholars have died recently without leaving anything behind. Equally, on the other side, I'd love to see a book series called The Generation of American Buddhist Teachers. And yes, we have early books like Suzuki Roshi's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and we have Chögyam Trungpa's Meditation in Action. But there are so many new generations of Buddhist teachers. I would love to have had even a chapter of the reflections of John Daido Luri Roshi, who I think was an absolutely miraculous Zen teacher, and have these teachers who are now functioning in American Buddhism share the same sorts of things so that people who are looking at the development of Buddhism in the United States could benefit from these people before they die, and that would help us with integrating the kinds of work that Jeff Wilson and Christine Walters and Shannon Hickey and Scott Mitchell and so forth are doing, and could inform their studies. So I would like to see that going forward. The people I have tried this out on don't seem to be terribly interested in it. I asked Bob Thurman if he would be interested in doing a chapter, and he said yes, it would be a great idea, but it wouldn't be at the top of my list. And I can understand that, given how busy he is. But I would love to see chapters like that move to the top of people's list, so that we can document what these people have done in the 70s and 80s and 90s and so forth as the discipline and the practice have grown.
Yeah, I think that is a wonderful idea, and I like that title concept of reflections. And I think we can certainly talk about that more in a future episode, because you're exactly right. One of the things that we would like to do is capture and save for others in the future to look back and see what were the attitudes, what were the leaders of that time thinking as this progressed. And we see that as the Zen centers get older, and those founders are getting at an age where we really want to have those conversations sooner rather than later, because there may not be a later. Justin, how about you? What do you have as some concluding thoughts for today's roundtable?
Following up on what Sarah had said earlier about there being little forward movement in the studies, and our inability to categorize things, I was reminded of a lecture I heard, I think last spring, from a medieval theologian or medieval historian, and he said scholars are still debating about when to demarcate early, middle, high medieval time periods. So I think our debates in Buddhist studies are not going to be settled anytime too soon. But we have had some forward movement. Some terms like Hinayana are no longer used by scholars to discuss Theravada Buddhism. Lamaism is no longer acceptable as a term for Tibetan Buddhism. So we do make some little bits of forward progress. And that also reminded me of a remark that Richard Gombrich made a couple of years ago. And he stated that we're basically 100 years behind Christian studies in the world of Buddhist studies. We're really just getting started. So that makes it kind of exciting, but at the same time, frustrating too. So I think along with that, I just wanted to thank you for having me. And I should shout out to Jeff Wilson, because he was the person who helped bring me into this back in 2006, 2007, when he first created the Buddhism in the West group for AAR. I was a part of that for several years and got to see some of the papers and help discuss them. So that was very good. And to Danny and Chuck and Sarah, thank you to you all.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Justin. And we'll be reaching out to Jeff for a future episode on that.
Good.
Sarah, let's move on to you. What are some of your concluding thoughts about today's topic?
Sure. I just have three quick comments. Following up on what Chuck had just said, I wholeheartedly agree that those 5 categories, ethnicity, practice, engagement, democratization, and adaptation, that he talks about in Faces of Buddhism in America, are absolutely useful, and Luminous Passage. I've been thinking about these 5 categories in my own work recently. Next, I just want to talk about this idea of the visibility of Asian Buddhist communities. Again, I refer back to the Tibetan Buddhist communities, primarily the Toronto community, which is an extremely vibrant community. I don't know if anyone has any experience with the Toronto Tibetan community, but they're very active. And I would argue that one way in which they're making themselves visible is through technology, through movies, through new things like Twitter. It was not really new, I guess, but how they're actually using social media, Facebook, for instance, to make their presence known within the larger Tibetan community and establishing connections with the New York community. And then lastly, I just want to mentioned that some of what Chuck is talking about in terms of the life stories of academics and Buddhist leaders in the field is actually, again, being done in the Canadian context. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Wild Geese book that was put out by Victor Horry, John Harding, and Alex Susi a couple of years ago, but some of important Canadian teachers' life stories are told in there, as well as the forthcoming book by the same gentleman editors called Flowers on the Rock. So there is some work being done on at least the Canadian Buddhist teachers and academics over the years.
As an addendum to what Sarah has just said, I think that anybody that's interested in Canadian Buddhism must absolutely look at the website that's been created by John Negru, Karma Yonten Gyatso, who has probably done more to disseminate information on Canadian Buddhism than anybody out there. His work is just never-ending, and he has a ton of energy and has provided an immense amount of stuff.
Awesome. Thank you, Chuck, for the addendum. And Sarah, thank you very much for those concluding thoughts. And Danny, how about you? What are your reflections on today's conversation?
Well, a couple quick ones. The first would be, I can't tell you how much I appreciate what Chuck says about this importance of writing reflections, memoirs, whatever you want to call it. I'm reviewing Chuck's memoir right now and kind of giving it a careful look that way. It really stands out to me why this is important to kind of contextualize certain arguments, to understand why maybe some lines of thinking got pursued while others did not. It's been an extremely revelatory experience reading Chuck's book and now thinking about it as I write about it. And to give you kind of a personal story of why I think this is so important, I had lunch last week with Louis Lancaster. A couple of my colleagues and I went out with him, and at one point I had heard through the grapevine that he had known Michael Eris and Aung San Suu Kyi, and so I just asked him about it while we were having lunch. And it turned out he was quite close with both of them. Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, is the Nobel Peace Laureate. Her husband, Michael Eris, was a great Tibetologist at Oxford. And, among other things, Lou went on vacation with them. He was present when their son Alex was born and blessed by a community of High Burmese monks, and General May Win attended that as well. And this was in the house that she was under house arrest in. And in addition to all of Lou's extraordinary work in Buddhist studies and experience and people he studied with and worked with, just his life story is extraordinary. And I think my suspicion is Lou would be much like Bob Thurman and kind of and demure from the possibility of writing his memoirs, but I think it's hugely important. So whether these scholars end up writing them down or their graduate students end up interviewing them and recording these things somewhere, I think preserving these reflections would be really important in terms of not only knowing something about these individuals and the extraordinary experience they've had, but also help us better understand certain conversations in academia. In addition, I just wanted to sort of also respond to Justin's comment about invisibility. And, I think I made the point early on that my personal feeling is that a lot of what Chuck has said has been misrepresented. I suppose I'll just be real blunt about it. And at the same time, I think some of these conversations, that whether it's from Jeff Wilson or Wako Shannon Hickey or others, are important to have. I might question Chuck as the target for them, but it's an interesting dynamic that I think is happening, right now, and I find, frankly, the Angry Asian Buddhist blog really useful and really helpful in terms of my own reflection in the work that I do on where I'm paying attention, where I'm not paying attention. And I thought a really interesting thing that happened last year was the whole Maha Teachers Conference in Garrison, New York. And I know there was the Huffington Post and some other people had written about it, and this came up, the kind of not huge representation of Asian teachers there. And I remember one of the organizers, Suryadas or Jack Cornfield, were sort of quoted as saying, well, we tried, we sent out invitations, we wrote emails. And, I had to kind of laugh when I saw that here in Rosemead, when we're working with local Vietnamese Buddhist communities, Chinese Buddhist communities, Taiwanese Buddhist communities, personal interaction is really important. So when we want a certain involvement from local temples, it's very important to not write an email, but to go and sit down and have a cup of tea, talk, face-to-face communication is really important. So I think there's a lot of room for us as both scholars and practitioners to investigate our own communication dynamics, our own efforts, and with the goal of better practices, deeper community, all of that. So for all that's been said, I did want to also just sort of underscore, I think we can always strive to do better, but I don't think anybody's not saying that either.
Yeah, I think that ongoing striving is an important message that we're all interested in. That we all want to move things forward in this ongoing development of Buddhism as it encounters a new culture, and a culture that is itself in flux and changing and adapting. Well, everyone, I thank you very much. I'll go through one at a time to make thanks. Chuck Prebish, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. This was great fun. Thank you.
And Sarah Haynes, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Ted.
And Justin Whitaker, thank you as well for your time today.
Thanks, Ted.
And Danny Fisher, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Sarah, Justin, and especially Chuck. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.